Hello, everybody, and welcome to the FightFit Podcast. We've got Dr. Michael Boquest. Have I pronounced that right?
That is right, indeed.
Michael is an anesthetist.
Correct. Yep.
Have I pronounced that right?
Anesthetist, that's exactly right.
Anesthetist,
Yep.
cool.
Well done.
And you've done a course today a little bit regarding the coronavirus, COVID-19.
Just a very specialized course in terms of how to manage somebody in a very specific setting.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think we're here today to talk a little bit more generally about the virus,
absolutely.
and maybe elucidate some sort of details that people don't really might want to talk about or might want to hear about. So I guess we'll start with the transmission of the virus and how that's sort of done.
Firstly, I'm not an expert virologist and I'm not an expert on this virus. So it's important that, any information source is also backed up by other information through the government, through the chief health medical officer, etc. But I mean, obviously, there's a lot of anxiety out there about this particular virus, which is a pandemic at the moment. What that means that it's the reason why there's a lot of anxiety and why it's an issue is that this is a virus that is not, is a new virus, hence the term novel virus, to the human population, to our species, where, it's come from another species. There's some question whether it came from bats via another channel, pangolin or whatever in Wuhan in China. But the source is unknown, really, but probably in other species. The reason why that's dangerous is that we don't have a natural immunity to it. Most of the coughs and colds that we get, or quite a lot of the coughs and colds and the normal sort of winter type, lurgies are actually coronaviruses, but not this coronavirus.
Right.
Okay. And the reason why this one is a big problem is because our immune system, reacts differently, or in some people it reacts differently and sometimes overreacts, leading to problems with pneumonia.
So every time there is a new sort of strain of flu during the flu season, it's generally a coronavirus?
Oh, no. Okay. That's a very interesting point you've just brought up. This is not influenza. Okay. This is a very different virus. Influenza is a very specific virus as well, and that tends to change. And we have, different strains of influenza, and we get vaccinated every year with slightly different flu vaccines based on the type of flu that we've seen the previous year. But influenza is a different family of viruses altogether. The colds that we get, some of them are coronaviruses. The cold is not the flu. Influenza is a very different thing. But it is an important point because we're coming into flu season. In fact, there is influenza in the community at the moment. And so it's really, really important this year to get a flu vaccine, okay? Because we don't want a situation where you've got rampant influenza and a coronavirus in the community.
Could it heighten the influenza due to the amount of coronavirus that is running around?
Having a bad flu season on top of this wouldn't help.
Right.
Okay, usually you don't get two viruses, at the same time sort of ramping up each other's destructive potential. But if you've got, in a population, the flu, and it could be a bad flu, and influenza mainly affects older people in terms of death, and it kills people every year. People forget this.
Okay,
right?
so that's a common misconception that is being floated around, that this is just the flu. So it's not just the flu.
It's not just the flu. This is not influenza.
Right.
This is a new virus that we as a species have not seen before.
Okay. And so with the flu, obviously...
Yeah, go for it. I will say this is very similar, or quite similar, to two previous viruses, both of which were coronaviruses, that caused epidemics in the past. And one was SARS, which is severe acute respiratory syndrome. That is a coronavirus that shares probably about 70+% of the genetic material. These are RNA viruses that make up this particular coronavirus, and MERS, which is Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, which is another type of coronavirus. Now, the good news is that this virus is not as deadly as they are. Both SARS had a mortality of about 10%, and MERS, I think, was 40 or 30 or 40%, which is, that's devastating. The good thing about those was that they
weren't
spread
airborne transmission.
They didn't spread that easily, correct. Right. The bad thing about this is that it spreads much more easily, and it spreads via airborne droplets mainly, and also can survive on surfaces, they think, for up to 9 hours.
Is there certain characteristics of this is the fact that this isn't as much of a deadly virus, is that synonymous with the fact that it's more transmittable?
Look, I don't know the answer to that. It's an interesting question. Probably because if you have a very deadly virus that kills you rather quickly, well, obviously you're no good as a host to that virus when you die, right? And so it tends to burn out a bit more. Perhaps that, and that's not a bad thing. It's not so good if you've got it, but from a population perspective. Whereas this virus, may be the vast majority of people, right, and particularly younger people, may not even have any symptoms or may have very mild symptoms. And so they can then, the virus can then be spread much more widely. And it's really a numbers game because, if you get 30 or 40% of a population infected, and out of that 30 or 40%, you get, 10 or 15% that need hospitalisation, that's a huge number of people. And out of that 10 or 15%, you may get, and I'm guessing the figures here exactly, we're not quite sure, but, maybe 5 or 7% of those people need intensive care. That's a huge number of people, okay? And then we're talking about mortality as well. So, different age groups seem to have different mortalities. Fortunately, younger people seem to have a mortality of, about 0.02%, which is low. But again, if you've got a lot of young people with it, that means some young people will die from it, okay, or get sick and die from it.
Well, but when you say young people, we're talking about young people with obesity. We're talking about young people with asthma.
It's another good point. We're talking about young people who don't have those comorbidities, whereas people who may be immunosuppressed or are sick in other ways have a higher risk of developing a severe, illness from it.
Yeah.
In terms of older, people, but it is very important that people who are young and healthy don't disregard it, because you don't want to go spreading it about. You don't want to go spreading it to your grandparents or your parents, who, if they're over 70, may have an 8% mortality if they get it, which is, very high.
Scary, yeah.
It's scary. And you don't want to go spreading it to people that may have other illnesses, etc.
Yeah.
And that's where this whole concept of, needing to self-isolate or needing to maintain a proper social distance comes in.
Right. I think that's the common problem that people are having, is that everybody wants to go about their daily life and sort of remain as normal as possible.
We can't.
But yeah, as you said, when people don't have any symptoms, they may not have any idea that they've got it. It's going to be so easily transmitted.
Well, yeah, except again, look, it seems that you're not really shedding or not really that infectious until about 24 hours before, for about the period of 24 hours before you develop symptoms. And when I say that, symptoms, fever, sore throat, cough,
Those are the common ones.
Right? Those are the common symptoms, okay? And most people that's all they'll have, okay? And, it'll be an inconvenience more than anything else. If you go down if you're probably infectious 24 hours prior to that, we think. We don't know. And those symptoms can be very mild. And this is the thing with children is, they're very unlikely to show too many symptoms or be sick with it, but they can spread it.
That's another thing that I guess is kind of an upside about this is that kids
very
can't spread it.
And people are talking about the influenza pandemic back in 1918, so 100 odd years ago after World War One, which was a devastating thing that it's interesting because most people don't know about it, never heard of it, but it killed probably 100 million people. It actually killed more people than World War One and Two combined. However, the thing about that particular flu, and that was an avian influenza, that is not coronavirus, that is not this virus. It was a bird flu, okay?
Right. Is that more deadly now, or is modern technology?
No, the bird flu is just as deadly, believe me, if it gets out.
Just as deadly as corona?
More deadly.
More deadly than this coronavirus.
Yeah.
Right.
Actually, the influenza in pandemic had a mortality of about 2 or 3%.
Right.
So probably getting towards similar to this, we think, at a high end of the coronavirus.
Right.
Yeah. But nevertheless, it tended to affect people in their prime more. Okay. So, younger people, which is very different than flu these that we're used to, which tends to actually, its mortality tends to be very much skewed towards older people.
I think that this would be a very different narrative if that were the case, if it was infecting and really the mortality was worse with young people.
Yeah, it'd be a very different narrative.
Yeah.
Okay, except that we can't be complacent because we don't know about it. And when we say old people, well, I've got parents that are, late 70s. I don't want them to, and they're otherwise very well. I don't want them to get sick and die. And my age group has a mortality of about 2%, which is a significant mortality.
Right.
If you get it.
Yep. And so going back to the flu and the flu season that's coming up, so is it, I've heard different sort of statistics and different sort of figures being thrown around that, 26 degrees can kill this virus, or this virus dies at 26 degrees. Do we have the literature yet to say that?
Maybe not. I don't know.
Right.
I'm not an expert in that. However, it can be quite easily killed by bleachers and things like that. Alcohol, soap and water is the best thing. Okay. Proper hand washing. Really, being vigilant with that will be very protective.
Right.
Hand sanitizers work. Okay. It's not a particularly robust virus, it seems, in terms of it's pretty easy to kill. We need to be vigilant, not touching your face. We do that all the time, as a habit, actually. But, thinking about it. The distance is important because, droplets, saliva droplets tend to travel about 1 metre. And so keeping 1.5 metres away, you're sort of out of range.
So when people laugh at the social distancing and the 1.5 metres and everything,
there's
that's actually,
because if you cough, it'll probably go 1.5 metres.
Right.
Right. And if you're, it's like, I guess, getting in a bomb blast zone. Do you know what I mean? If you're outside that zone where you're okay.
Okay.
So it's not, these things aren't just sort of made up out of the blue. There are reasons for it. And that reason is for, to reduce droplet spread.
And droplets, obviously the most common cause of transmission?
Well, yes, and certainly the most risky form for somebody like me that may be intubating or, putting breathing tubes down. However, it can be on surfaces and it can last on surfaces for some period of time.
I've heard that 9 days.
I don't know exactly. I've certainly seen 9 hours and whatnot. So, again, that's why it's important in gymnasiums, for instance, to have good surface cleaning and, regular cleaning, as well as sort of, maintaining distance between people, et cetera, et cetera. I know at FightFit it's a bit hard when you're doing, pad work and whatnot. people just have to sort of
I guess people
consider the risk.
Will make do as well with what we do have. I mean, in terms of gyms, I think it's another interesting one that for people who want to still go to the gym.
Sure. And I mean, the gyms, there's no reason not to, if you're careful. Look, okay, in northern Italy at the moment, which is sort of like, coming out on social media and in the media, all these sort of doomsday pictures of, people, sort of in hospitals not coping and this, that and the other. In northern Italy, there's a number of people who have COVID-19 is about 1 in 10,000 at the moment, right? So that means if you're walking about the streets, you've got 9,999 other people that don't have it.
Right.
Right? So if you come into the gym and do a bit of, pad work or something like that, well, there's a very small, and in Melbourne at the moment, or Victoria, there's 100 people that we know of that have got it out of a population of 5 million. Okay, and there might be another 1,000 that, have it and it hasn't come up yet.
Right.
And that number will change, of course, but at the moment, the numbers are actually very low.
Right.
And that's not to be complacent about it, but, it's also not to say, oh my God, the world's ending, we're all doomed, because that's not the case at all.
Yeah. But it is something that obviously we want to keep as much control as we can possibly have
Absolutely.
over. Organisations like gyms
we
need to have the utmost precaution.
And everybody does, and that's what's happening at the moment. So that it's a matter of being prepared. We in Australia have a lot of advantages. First of all, we have an excellent medical system, and which is, I'm not familiar with Italy's medical system, but I know ours is excellent, and we are well stocked. I've just come from, as I say, a major private hospital, and we're doing, a lot of preparation work. We're well stocked with equipment, and we may need it, and things aren't going to be, let's face it, it might be a bit of a torrid time. However, we've also got the lead time to prepare properly, which is what we're doing, and this is the time to try and limit any actual transmission to keep that, to keep those case numbers of very sick people as low as possible, so that we can cope. Okay, so instead of having this tsunami of people who are sort of needing ventilation coming in, we can have it under a much more controlled circumstance.
And obviously, another factor might be that we mightn't be have as much resources as we maybe need for the projections of where it could go. So a bit of time,
absolutely, to build those resources and planning,
well.
and to to keep a lid on it. That's all we can do. I mean, and then of course, it is important to remember that there's a lot of work going on, both in Australia and overseas, in terms of developing a vaccine for it. That's the other thing I want to say is, if you happen to be an anti-vaxxer, wisen up, get vaccinated.
Yeah.
Get your flu vax, right? Forget this anti-vaxxer bullshit, because it has been a dangerous philosophy, and it is based on pseudoscience. It is wrong. It's wrong for all of the viruses and organisms that we can vaccinate against. We should vaccinate.
And it's one of the gifts of modern technology as well.
Well, I mean, people forget smallpox, for instance. Edward Jenner was the father of vaccine when he introduced cowpox to protect against smallpox. Now, smallpox was a much more deadly disease than COVID-19, and it has now been eliminated from the face of the earth. So, that's the power of vaccination.
Yep.
When we don't have it, we get measles outbreaks like was in Samoa recently and killed 2,500 kids, remember?
Yep.
That was just the other week. It hardly made any news. Imagine 2,500 children dying in Melbourne.
Yeah, it'd be just horrible. Yeah.
And that was due to lack of vaccination.
Right.
And, we haven't got a vaccine against this thing yet. We will have one. Fortunately, it doesn't seem to mutate that quickly, unlike flu.
What do you mean by mutate?
Change.
Right.
It's genetic.
Okay, so it has the ability to...
All viruses have and in fact, bacteria have the ability to, change their genetic configuration over time as a population. That's called mutation.
Right.
That change can either be, it's a random thing. It's just like genetic mutations in any living organism.
As in, could that affect the severity of...
Yes, it could make it worse. It could make it better. But we don't know. I mean, it's random, just like toss a coin. Having said that, influenza changes very quickly. And that's one reason why, vaccination against influenza can be partially effective, not always fully effective. And it's a bit of a guesswork. Whereas COVID-19 seems to be relatively more stable, which is good. It means that we're more likely to get a vaccine.
Yeah.
That's more effective.
And what for people who don't have the necessary vaccines, where can they go? What can just their general GP, just anywhere?
Oh, sure. Well, look, the flu vax that come out, you go to your GP.
Yep.
I think they were doing it in pharmacies and things like that. And the flu vax will not protect you against COVID-19. Okay, but it's important to get the flu vax.
Absolutely.
Okay, because you might as well get because you can get influenza, and which can lay you low just as easily.
Yep.
But I think at the moment it's important to do everything we possibly can to keep as well as we can, and that's why going to the gym, for instance, is not a bad thing. You want to keep fit.
Yep.
You want to keep healthy. Both physically and also psychologically, because it's a great stress relief. Everyone's getting a bit stressed out at the moment,
Absolutely.
And gymnasiums are coming here to FightFit, for instance, is an excellent stress relief for me. It has been for quite a few years now.
Yep.
So until they actually shut these places down on the advice of the chief medical officer, there's no reason not to come.
Yep.
Okay, there's no increase. You're not putting yourself in any greatly increased risk. I mean, unless you've sort of got big crowds.
Yep. And I think that, it would be a way to keep your body moving, keep your blood flowing
Absolutely.
a little bit. You drink lots of liquids, eat healthy during this time, and
well, it's a lot. It's a lot better for you than sitting home and getting anxious and getting out the packet of ciggies that you put away 10 years ago and
that's
start
the last
smoking
thing
because
you want to be doing right
that's
now.
the last thing, because the other thing is if you do smoke, stop.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're more likely to develop a severe illness with COVID-19 if you smoke.
Yeah.
There's also some questions about a common medication called Ibuprofen, which is an anti-inflammatory. Now, there's not absolute evidence, but it seems like there's some trending evidence that taking ibuprofen can increase the risk of developing a severe pneumonia with COVID-19.
Yep.
Okay, and the reasons for that are complex, and they're due to
some sort of like a nuance in the
well, no, it's due to the effect of COVID-19 on an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme,
right?
And which the ibuprofen can also increase receptors for that, and so there are complex nuance in mechanisms involved. So the reason I mention that is because in cold and flu tablets you often have ibuprofen,
right?
And people have probably put ibuprofen away and other non-steroidals away.
I heard that paracetamol was better to use.
So that's the message: is use paracetamol.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So if there's one thing out of the podcast, or two things, or three things: get immunised against the flu, don't smoke, use paracetamol if you get a fever.
Yeah.
Okay. And keep social distance and actually do the right thing.
Yep. And in terms of vaccinations, what would the process be for making a vaccination for this? Because
again, I'm not by any means an expert in that, but basically, look, they've sequenced the gene sequence of the virus. We know that, and that also there's certainly a team in Melbourne that have, at the Doherty Institute, that have identified the complex immune response to the thing, including the antibodies that are produced. And, all of these steps in terms of saying, okay, well, this is what we can do to use as a vaccine. There's another group that's looked at this a mechanism of so-called gene clamping to inhibit the virus from getting into the cells, etc. But all these are very complex sort of things that are being worked on. But basically, the process involves identifying something that works, then testing it, both in vitro, in glass, and in animal models, and then, human trials and production. And usually for a drug, that takes years.
Yeah.
Okay. But, for something from scratch, this will be a lot quicker. But it'll still take 12 months.
Right. So I've had most of my vaccinations as a kid.
Yeah, sure.
And like for the Hep A one, for example, I actually asked my GP last time I saw him, and he said that like there's some sort of like they kill the disease and then they inject it into you kind of thing.
Hepatitis A is a passive, what's called a passive vaccine. So, I mean, again, we're getting into areas that I'm an anesthetist. I'm a specialist in anesthesia and critical care medicine. But nevertheless, hepatitis A protects you passively. So you just get pretty much the antibodies given to you. So that isn't like, it's not a vaccine in the sense that it's you making antibodies.
Right. Okay.
And most vaccines, so if you get the flu shot or whatever, or triple antigen, to whooping cough and things. Sorry, Bash.
That's all right.
You get antigens. You get, that's an antigen.
Yeah.
Okay, that then kicks your own immune system into going, oh, geez, what's this? I'll respond to this in multiple different ways, including making antibodies.
Right. So something that might be more like your sort of wheelhouse, I guess, would be like the progression of, when somebody gets sick and gets infected, and how the symptoms might increase, and at what point you should be sort of seeking medical help if your symptoms sort of increase to a certain level.
Yeah, look, I mean, fever, cough, shortness of breath, and really what is killing people with this virus is pneumonia, okay? And what I mean by that is inflammation of the lungs, and that inflammation of the lungs usually is associated with, if you like, an overreaction of the immune system, okay, of your own body fighting against the virus, and that causes thickening of and fluid within the lung tissues themselves, which then leads to loss of efficiency in the transmission of the gases it needs to transmit. You breathe in oxygen, or you breathe in air, you take up oxygen, you breathe out carbon dioxide and a few other gases. When the lung membrane, the alveoli, the small tiny membranes of the lungs thicken, that process is severely inhibited, okay? And so you get a decreased ability to oxygenate, okay? Right. And so your body will you'll then feel short of breath, okay? You'll breathe more quickly. You'll become what we call tachypneic, and you may get an increased heart rate because your heart's trying to pump around more oxygen to your organs, so it can compensate a little bit by pumping more blood around, and that can progress to you become fatigued, okay? Obviously your immune system's involved. You have a high fever, etc. And so when do you get worried? Well, you get when you're symptomatic like that, then it certainly would be time to talk to your GP or go to one of the clinic, not to liaise with one of the clinics. You don't just turn up there. You need to actually, as far as I understand, call ahead, etc., particularly to your general practice, so that, you don't not going infecting everyone else. Plus or minus to, a hospital. Now, the vast majority of people who get this are not going to go down that route.
Right.
As I said before, though, it's a numbers game. You get a lot of people, you get a small percentage of those people that will then actually be quite a large number of people.
Okay. So you're talking about like what the quote unquote super spreaders that like.
Well, I don't know. I mean, these sort of terms, people, what I'm talking about is that most people are not going to have that severe of an illness.
Right. Okay. And most of those people will obviously be, young people and fit people. Because there was 4 basketballers in America who got diagnosed with it, got tested, and they said they literally did not feel a thing. They had no idea that they had it.
You can be asymptomatic, yes. And that's what we're probably seeing in children.
Yep. Okay. And so in terms of the spread of the virus, is there sort of any forecast or anything that we can anticipate in terms of how quickly it might spread or what?
Well, there are all sorts of mathematical models, and it's what's called an exponential, process. And so that means that, it doubles on itself. It's like compound interest.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that, it starts off with a small amount and then, sort of builds in a logarithmic way, not a straight line way, not a sort of linear fashion. It's more of a logarithmic fashion.
Right, of course. The upside down pyramid.
Yeah, and so that, but, again, I'm not an epidemiologist, so I don't know. But I don't know, they're talking about maybe 6 months.
Yeah,
I don't think we're not gonna see people, we're not gonna see our hospitals overwhelmed in the next week or two.
Yeah.
And hopefully by having that time that we've seen, compared to other countries, and doing the things and actually doing them, actually playing your part, then that will help.
Right.
And what I mean by that is not blithely going, oh, fuck this, it's, it's just a load of crap. Actually thinking about it and if you've been overseas, you come back, make sure you self-isolate.
Do your quarantine.
Do your quarantine, think hard about, if you feel unwell, maybe it's not the time to go and see, your grandparents.
Yep.
Things like that. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
And be mindful, I'd say, of hygiene principles, in particular hand washing and things like that.
Right.
Don't go coughing in people's faces, just, do all those things that are sort of motherhood statements.
Yeah. And last question, were we prepared for this, and how can we, if not, or how can we prepare better in the future as a society, I guess?
We're prepared for it in the sense that we've known about it since December last year, and the Chinese probably knew about it in November. And so we've watched it coming, but that's only a few months. And it's sort of, it really is out of the blue. And I think, we're in uncharted territory. Nothing like this we've had we had, swine flu, back in 2009, I think.
Yep.
And that was a very significant illness. That there were a lot of people in intensive care with swine flu. We had SARS, of course, back in the early 2000s. But not projected pandemics like this, okay? As in the potential for, huge numbers to be affected.
Right.
We're trying, obviously the organisation, my college and the Australian Society of Anaesthetists and other medical colleges and hospitals, doing, we're developing protocols and very quickly and getting as much evidence as we possibly can on what the best thing is to do in terms of limiting, out of control pandemonium, or systems being overwhelmed, and obviously also how to treat individual patients, etc., which we know how to do really anyway. Economically, it's a real disaster.
Mm-hmm.
The world shut down. I was going to go to America for a month, and that's gone. Nobody's coming here. Nobody's the whole sort of.
That's a whole nother podcast.
That's a whole
the economic
podcast,
side of
but
things.
The whole cascade
Yep.
of society is, it's cascading through society.
Right.
Having said that, the important thing is that people, actually think about other people and not, go off and hoard and, fight for the last bit of mints on the bloody supermarket shelves and all that.
I would love to see.
Actually just does not do anything.
I would love to see in the next few weeks, during this whole synthesis of catastrophe that's going on in terms of like economic and supply chains, and then different industries being affected so badly that people sort of just stop
people can
panic
stop,
buying and panic hoarding, and
there is no need for that. Right? There's plenty of supply of all these things. All of that side of things is artificial. It's made by humans. The virus has got nothing to do with that, right? It's basically greedy, selfish behaviour on a part of the large proportion of the population, or a significant proportion of the population, certainly not the majority, but that has led to unavoidable hardship. And frankly, I'm pretty ashamed to be an Australian.
Yeah. No, it is absolutely shameful. And just last question, I promise.
Yeah, sure. No worries.
As a medical professional, from what you've seen so far over the past few weeks, would you think that the budget that the government could sort of spend on epidemiology could be drastically increased in the face of something like this?
Well, I mean, I think that's sort of, again, a bit outside my scope of expertise, but I think, look, there's plenty of money getting splashed around now, I can tell you now. I think that at a ground level and sort of working up, look, we're becoming as prepared as we possibly can be. Yeah. And we're in a lot better situation here than a lot of other places, I can tell you now.
Yeah.
And so if you need to be anywhere, here's not a bad place to be. We'll ride this out.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for coming on today. Can't shake your hand, obviously, because of social distancing.
I do suggest, for those old enough to remember Mork and Mindy, nanu.
Well, maybe they will remember. But thank you so much for the work you're doing. We need all the medical professionals that we can get at the moment. Thank you for enlightening our listeners a little bit.
I hope it's
as to what's happening. It's definitely helped me. So thank you very much for listening as well, guys.
All right, cheers.